So without further ado, and very promptly at 6:30, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Christine O'Neill to deliver her lecture, Colourful Creations in Joyce and Bosch. This lecture was supposed to be delivered at this very time last year. And of course, we were so new to the pandemic this time 12 months ago, and everything had to be changed and cancelled. But look at us now, we're so able to log on to our Zoom lectures without a bother. And we're thrilled that we could rearrange the talk and present it this evening. This will be the final talk in our spring lecture series, and we've been thrilled to be able to host these, and we really hope to continue on. Of course, Bloomsday coming up, but also into an autumn lecture series. This talk will really look at the works of James Joyce and Hieronymus Bosch, who are so famous for their inventiveness and colourful creations. They both draw on biblical stories and late medieval imagery. And this will explore some of those shared visionary elements, track some intriguing animal-like creatures, and contemplate the four last things, and descend into the vibrant hells of Joyce and Bosch. A little bit about Dr. Christine O'Neill that we're so delighted to have with us. She studied English and German at the University of Zurich and Trinity College, Dublin. Her publications include To Fine a Point, a stylistic analysis of the Eumaeus episode in Ulysses, Inductive Scrutinies, a collection of essays by Fritz Zen, the Joycean Memoirs of Fritz Zen, and Niall Montgomery's Dublin Man. She is a regular contributor to the International Joyce publications and has worked as a researcher, editor, translator, and arts administrator in recent years. So this multi-talented friend of the James Joyce Centre, please welcome Dr. Christine O'Neill. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Is this audible and visible?
You're lovely and clear, Christine.
Okay, great. Thank you very much indeed. Well, thank you very much, Dorina, for this generous introduction, for your invitation, obviously, and thank you all very much for being here this evening. In addition to what Dorina already said, I would also like to connect those hell elements of Joyce's and Bosch's art with some vital present-day concerns, as you will see. Of course, the worldviews of Bosch, who was born in 1450, and Joyce were very different from our present-day outlook. Indeed, in some respects, they are in stark contrast to it. In the Western world, in the late Middle Ages, the prevalent understanding was of an ordered, hierarchical universe, divinely decreed and unchangeable. Rather astonishingly, this understanding still persisted in Ireland roughly 400 years later, largely due to the ongoing and pervasive influence of the Roman Catholic Church, which would go on to shape the constitution of the state. During Joyce's time, modernity was only beginning to make itself felt. The earliest spiritual and mental framework for both Bosch and Joyce would have been the Bible, where we are told in the Hebrew scriptures that God created all things, including land and sea, plants, animals, and humans. Human beings, the last of God's creation and made in God's image, were elevated to being both the crowning glory and the masters or rulers of creation. It is God's injunction that human beings should have dominion over the earth and its creatures. And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. Other versions of the Bible substitute the phrase have dominion over with the equally commanding be masters of, and the verb subdue with conquer. But no matter how the Hebrew injunction is translated, the phrase is expressed a relationship of power and control. It is important to remember that the single most important human invention was the development of agriculture that began about 12,000 years ago. Ever since, humankind has played a dominant role in an enterprise that continues to expand. This relationship of dominance calls to mind the term Anthropocene, which since the start of the present millennium has gained currency increasingly. Some earth scientists use Anthropocene to denote the current geological age as the period during which human activity has been the dominant influence on climate and the environment. However, it is still considered an informal unit in geology, not least because no uniform onset timing for this period has yet been agreed. Whether or not the Anthropocene will be accepted as a geological period by geologists, there is no doubting that humans have become a geological force. In the Judeo-Christian world, this development has long taken place with reference to God's injunction in Genesis cited earlier, and especially since the Renaissance, God's command has been invoked as a justification for all sorts of endeavors that conquered and exploited the earth and its creatures. Another influential expression of hierarchical thinking is the great chain of being. With its many categories, it classifies all matter and life in strict hierarchy. In medieval Christianity, the great chain of being was thought to have been decreed by God and was considered immutable. Hence, any disruption or violation of it was considered to threaten the balance of the whole world in its social, natural, and cosmic order. The chain starts with God at the top and progresses downwards through angelic beings to humans, animals, plants, and minerals. In the great chain of being, God and the angels are understood to be entirely in spirit form, without material bodies and hence unchangeable, eternal. The humans beneath them consist of both spirit and matter. They can change and die and are thus essentially impermanent. Lower still are animals and plants in that order, while lowest of all are the mineral materials of the earth itself, which are seen to consist of matter only. Importantly, each being includes all the attributes of the beings below it in the chain, and each link may be divided further into its component parts. The most influential Christian angelic hierarchy was put forward as early as the 4th or 5th century by Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite in his book on the celestial hierarchy. However, the basic idea of ranking the world's organisms is much older and goes back to Aristotle's writings on biology from the 4th century BCE. This non-religious concept of the higher and lower organisms was later refashioned during the scholastic period by theologians such as Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. I have introduced the great chain of being to illustrate the time-honored tradition of the elevated position of humankind and the supremacy of the ordering mind, at least in the Western world. One eminently important binary opposition, which is shared not only by the monotheistic religions, is the concept of heaven and hell, of the virtuous being saved on the day of judgment and the sinful damned. Hell in particular has intrigued the minds of philosophers, theologians, artists, and ordinary people for several millennia, and at least as a common metaphor, it has survived to this day. Naturally enough, hell was also of prime concern to Bosch and Joyce. The etymology of the term is revealing. The Anglo-Saxon word hell is a translation of two Hebrew words, namely Sheol and Gehenna. It is important to note that these two words denote different realms. In the Hebrew scriptures, the word hell is generally used to translate the word Sheol, which is simply the place of the dead, usually without reference to happiness or the reverse. Sheol is a shadowy grave or pit to which all the dead go, both the righteous and the unrighteous. It is a place of stillness and darkness, cut off from life and from God. In the New Testament, however, things appear more complex as the word hell is used to translate two different words, namely Hades, generally meaning the same as Sheol, the abode of the dead, but also Gehenna, the place of retribution for evil deeds. Gehenna is the destination of the wicked, not only in Christian scripture, but also in rabbinic literature and Islamic scripture. Greek Gehenna, from Hebrew Gei bin Hinnom, valley of the son of Hinnom, is a small valley in Jerusalem. In the Hebrew scriptures, Gehenna was where some of the kings of Judah sacrificed their children by fire, and it was deemed to be cursed thereafter. It is to Gehenna that Jesus refers in Matthew's retelling of Jesus' indictment of the Pharisees. Ye serpents, ye generation of vipers, how can ye escape the damnation of hell? As a closer inspection of this place contributes to our understanding of hell in Joyce and Bosch, it is worth knowing that according to Matthew, the chief priests took the 30 pieces of silver that the repenting Judas had cast down in the temple, and with them bought the potter's field, or field of blood in Aramaic, in which to bury strangers. This site was at the southeast end of the Hinnom Valley, and its earth was composed of rich clay of a strong red color. The potter's field or field of blood is where Judas was buried. Also, it was said to be a quarter of Jerusalem where refuse was thrown and where amidst odors of decay, fires were burning perpetually. Thus, Gehenna was characterized by several traditional aspects of hell, such as fire, stench, and the color red. The complex and often terrifying treatment accorded to the realm of hell by both Bosch and Joyce is truly amazing. And it's particularly intriguing to see how they blur the lines of hierarchies and between species. And so, God's creatures may be a good place for me to start. As a simple example, such as the worm, may illustrate this. Although a lowly creature according to the great chain of being, Joyce pays it considerable attention by making it appear in various imaginary forms in Dubliners and a portrait of the artist. While the worm has positive associations in an encounter where the man with a stick calls the eye narrator a bookworm like myself, in the sisters it acquires sepulchral overtones in old Cotter's technical distilling jargon of faints and worms, and in a painful case it is transformed into a charged surreal image with somber religious overtones evoking the fabulous work of Bosch. No one wanted him. He was outcast from life's feast. He turned his eyes to the grey gleaming river winding along towards Dublin. Beyond the river he saw a goods train winding out of Kingsbridge station like a worm with a fiery head winding through the darkness obstinately and laboriously. The worm also burrows its way into chapter 3 of A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. The chapter is dominated by the hellfire sermons in which the lowly creature is memorably put at the service of the Christian message of damnation, both the literal worm and its metaphorical counterpart, the worm of conscience. Stephen imagines his body thrust out of men's sight into a long hole in the ground, into the grave, to rot, to feed the mass of its creeping worms and to be devoured by scuttling, plump-bellied rats. Later on, memorably quotes Saint Anselm. In earthly prisons, the poor captive has at least some liberty of movement. Not so in hell. There, by reason of the great number of the damned, the prisoners are heaped together in their awful prison, the walls of which are said to be 4,000 miles thick, and the damned are so utterly bound and helpless that, as a blessed saint, Saint Anselm writes in his book on similitudes, they are not even able to remove from the eye a worm that gnaws it. Apparently, though, this striking and scarifying image is not enough. As the preacher leads the boys from contemplating earthworms working on human corpses in this world and the next to contemplating a metaphorical worm, the worm of conscience. The second pain which will afflict the souls of the damned in hell is the pain of conscience. Just as in dead bodies worms are engendered by putrefaction, so in the souls of the lost there arises a perpetual remorse from the putrefaction of sin, the sting of conscience, the worm, as Pope Innocent III calls it, of the triple sting. The first sting inflicted by this cruel worm will be the memory of past pleasures. Oh, what a dreadful memory will that be! This is the second sting of the worm of conscience, a late and fruitless sorrow for sins committed. Divine justice insists that the understanding of those miserable wretches be fixed continually on the sins of which they were guilty. They will behold their sins in all their foulness and repent, but it will be too late, and then they will bewail the good occasions which they neglected. This is the last and deepest and most cruel sting of the worm of conscience. The conscience will say, you had time and opportunity to repent and you would not. That time is gone, gone forever. The sting of conscience, or worm of the triple sting then, consists of the memory of past pleasures, fruitless remorse, and good occasions neglected. Drawing on a long-established infernal inventory, Father Arnall populates his terrifying sermons on hell with a veritable menagerie of animals. Creeping worms and scuttling plump-bellied rats, squeaking mice and ape-like creatures, birds, elephants, pigs, a cock, a monkey and a serpent, a viper and an insect. Though Bosch, for his part, may not have depicted an earthworm gnawing an eye, his paintings are teeming with scuttling plump-bellied rats and ever different lindworms and lizards, along with amphibians and reptiles, including serpents. Between them, they populate the earth and its rivers, ponds and lakes, as well as hell, and intriguingly and disturbingly, apparently occasionally even paradise. They are seen emerging plentifully from the water and invading the land. They squat or move threateningly on tablecloths and bed covers. They brandish daggers, consort with nude maidens, and lick naked bodies. Remote from reality altogether, bizarre dragons display fantastical wings and sharp claws. While both Bosch and Joyce are exceptionally imaginative and extravagant in depicting the traditional mindset of dualistic thinking with painterly creatures and verbal creations, they also quietly unsettle it. Their work expresses traditional religious teaching in a style that is unique and powerful, yet frequently provocative at the same time, in that it flamboyantly transcends and transgresses neat distinctions. This blurring of boundaries is an important artistic device that both artists employ. In seemingly infinite variety, they select, construct, and transform organisms that are visually arresting. Nor do Joyce and Bosch limit their uninhibited intermingling of species to the religious realm. In a portrait of the artist as a young man, several protagonists are ascribed animal attributes. Moynihan had a snoutish face. Lynch's long, slender, flattened skull seemed the image of a hooded reptile. And the nameless gypsy-like student's face was equine in expression. Young women appear less terrestrial and are likened to birds. She seemed like one whom magic had changed into the likeness of a strange and beautiful seabird, describes Stephen's emotional transport at the sight of the young woman wading in the sea towards the end of chapter 4. In chapter 5, with sudden, almost religious inspiration, Stephen wonders if he sees life were a simple rosary of hours, her life simple and strange as a bird's life, her heart simple and willful as a bird's heart. More dynamically, in the phantasmagorical transformations of Circe, a dog metamorphoses from retriever to wolf dog to setter in a single paragraph. Joyce's verbal images continually remind of Bosch's painterly techniques that make humans grow wings or birds' heads or fishes' tails or have limbs made of vegetal matter. Bosch's bizarre creatures and astounding landscapes and weird architectural constructions, the mix of human, animal, vegetal and geological matter, seem inspired by visions and dreams, nightmares of the subconscious and the unconscious. The desires and fears of humankind, their secret attractions and repulsions are magnified and given physical expression. As with Bloom's antlered head in Circe, one is reminded of Freud's theories of dreams and the unconscious. It is not surprising that the surrealists claimed that their movement had been influenced by Bosch. Particularly enthusiastic among 20th century artists were André Breton and Salvador Dalí. You see here on the left the Garden of Eden from the Garden of Earthly Delights, and on the right a detail of it on the panel above, and below Dalí's work entitled The Great Masturbator, turned 90 degrees. Should be like this. Bosch's work plays havoc with reason and logic. It appeals to our instincts and perhaps for that very reason resonates well beyond its apparent narrative function. His paintings are strikingly evocative and memorable and draw attention to themselves in a way that transcends their immediate context. The same may, of course, be said of many a passage in Joyce, and Stephen's vision of his personal hell in a portrait is an impressive example. His vision is the result of his exposure to 2 days of Jesuit sermons on death, judgment, and hell at the school retreat. These are based on the spiritual exercises of 1548 of Saint Ignatius of Loyola that include meditations on sin and its consequences, particularly an extended meditation on hell, which specifically engages all the senses with its fires, smoke and brimstone, crying and wailing, filth and corruption, and its bitter taste. Moreover, Father Arnold's sermons draw extensively on an exceptionally florid devotional text entitled Hell Opened to Christians to Caution Them from Entering into It, written by Giovanni Pietro Pinamonti, an Italian Jesuit, around 1693. As you can see, this is the Derby edition of 1845. Apparently there is also a Dublin edition of 1868 by James Duffy of Wellington Quay. The preacher's impressive pulpit oratory has the desired effect. It manages to strike profound fear into Stephen, not least by the repeated injunction to imagine, imagine. At home that evening after dinner, his powerful imagination has indeed been set on fire as he imagines with the senses of his mind. He desired with all his will not to hear or see. He desired till his frame shook under the strain of his desire, and until the senses of his soul closed. They closed for an instant and then opened. He saw a field of stiff weeds and thistles and tufted nettle bunches. Thick among the tufts of rank, stiff growth lay battered canisters and clots and coils of solid excrement. A faint marsh light struggled upwards from all the audio through the bristling grey-green weeds. An evil smell, faint and foul as the light, curled upwards sluggishly out of the canisters and from the stale, crusted dung. Creatures were in the field, 1, 3, 6. Creatures were moving in the field hither and thither. Goatish creatures with human faces, horny-browed, lightly bearded and grey as India rubber. The malice of evil glittered in their hard eyes as they moved hither and thither, trailing their long tails behind them. A rictus of cruel malignity lit up greyly their old bony faces. One was clasping about his ribs a torn flannel waistcoat. Another complained monotonously as his beard stuck in the tufted weeds. Soft language issued from their spittleless lips as they swished in slow circles round and round the field, winding hither and thither through the weeds, dragging their long tails amid the rattling canisters. They moved in slow circles, circling closer and closer to enclose, soft language issuing from their lips, their long swishing tails besmeared with stale shite, thrusting upwards their terrific faces. Help! He flung the blankets from him madly to free his face and neck. That was his hell. God had allowed him to see the hell reserved for his sins, stinking, bestial, malignant, a hell of lecherous, goatish fiends. For him, for him. He sprang from the bed, the reeking odor pouring down his throat, clogging and revolting his entrails. Air, the air of heaven. He stumbled towards the window, groaning and almost fainting with sickness. At the washstand, a convulsion seized him within, and clasping his cold forehead wildly, he vomited profusely in agony. For an impressionable mind such as Stephen's, there is no escape from the toxic potential of Father Arnold's words. They are distilled in his hellish vision. Suggestively, Joyce similarly suffuses the narrative passages surrounding the Hellfire Sermon with its language and imagery. Affected by Father Arnold's introductory talk the evening before the retreat proper, Stephen begins to think of himself as sinking to the level of beasts, and his mind becomes somewhat unhinged. So he had sunk to the state of a beast that licks his chaps after meat. And staring out the window, he notices how forms pass this way and that through the dull light. The letters of the name of Dublin lay heavily on his mind, pushing one another surlily hither and thither with slow, boorish insistence. Stephen is increasingly disturbed by the Jesuits' oratory, and after the first day's sermons on death and judgment, he reckons that, yes, the preacher was right. Like a beast in its lair, his soul had lain down in its own filth. The second day's sermons on hell show him that he is well beyond any hope of ever rising with the angels. Stephen wants to be, quote, alone with his soul. Yet he hardly dares enter his room after dinner. The physical threshold is also a mental threshold. Joyce devotes almost a page and a half to describing Stephen's absolute terror at having to face his personal demons, and in so doing sounds many a note of the nightmare that follows. At every step his soul mounted with his feet, sighing in the ascent through a region of viscid gloom, the fiends that inhabit darkness. He waited still at the threshold as at the entrance to some dark cave. Faces were there, eyes, they waited and watched. Murmuring faces waited and watched. Murmurous voices filled the dark shell of the cave. He feared intensely in spirit and in flesh those words which had seemed to rise murmurously from the dark. Stephen is depicted as reverting to a childlike state, an earlier self in which he used to kneel beside his bed and pray. He even crawls up onto the bed, considering himself, quote, not worthy to be called God's child, collapses mentally, quote, the leprous company of his sins closed about him, breathing upon him, bending over him from all sides, unquote. Stephen is encircled until eventually there is no escape. The passages quoted serve to illustrate how Joyce builds up the scene to a crescendo, sentence by sentence, as if layer upon layer he creates a state of intense fear. The relentless rhetorical elaboration of the humiliations and tortures of hell described in the Hellfire sermons that are first given in the past tense of reported speech, then in the present tense of direct speech, is shown to induce a hysterical reaction in Stephen, with readers exposed to the same onslaught of terror. Surrounded by growing darkness as the light of reason is quenched, the fallen human being facing a nightmarish lair is consistently referred to as a beast. The sinner is losing all his bearings, his senses are assaulted, and in the gloom, forms and faces move hither and thither, encircling and watching him. It is interesting to note that Joyce must have had a particular attachment to this scene, as his notes for Stephen Hero at the end of the initial version of A Portrait of the Artist of 1904 mention an epiphany of hell. This is taken to refer to Epiphany number 6. And I let you read that yourself, give you a break from my voice. Epiphany number 6 allows us to see how Joyce rewrote earlier material into Stephen's nightmarish vision in A Portrait. Before looking at this in some detail, however, it is worth remembering that in Stephen Hero, he wiped away the effects of the sermons on Stephen in a few short sentences. When one evening Morris mentions the imminent school retreat, Stephen instantly becomes aware of how fundamentally his position has changed. Only 12 months ago, he had been clamoring for forgiveness and promising endless penances. He could hardly believe that it was no other than he who had clung so fiercely to the sole means of salvation which the Church vouchsafes to her guilty children. He marveled at the terror which had then possessed him. The topic recurs once more in the Wandering Rocks episode of Ulysses, when Haynes wonders what Stephen's idée fixe might be, and Buck Mulligan suggests that, quote, they drove his wits astray by visions of hell, unquote. In any case, Joyce reworked Epiphany number 6 by making several changes. Overall, he greatly expanded its length, not least by adding considerable verbal repetition, much of it to emphasize the struggling, sluggish, curling, slow circling hither and thither of the nightmarishly intense scene. Crucially, the relentless verbal repetition has a rather numbing, hypnotic effect. The intensity of Stephen's agony is conveyed as sound comes to prevail over meaning. Joyce diversified the locale, increasing, for example, the vegetation of stiff weeds and thistles of the Epiphany with tufted nettle bunches, the tufts of rank, stiff growth. And he added details of smell and sound. Joyce also piled on scatological details such as clots and coils of solid excrement, ordures, stale crusty dung, and long swishing tails besmeared with stale shite. He shone a creepy light on the grey-green scene, a faint marsh light. a light that sometimes appears in the light over marshy ground that is often attributable to the combustion of gas from decomposed organic matter. And he provided an offensive olfactory note by adding an evil smell, faint and foul as the light. All in all, the additional details afford readers a much fuller picture of Stephen's vision and his extreme distress. Most intriguingly, perhaps, this also applies to those confused forms. In a portrait, the satyr-like half-men, half-goats of the Epiphany become goatish creatures with human faces, horny-browed. And significantly, the reason for their evil nature is omitted, while the Epiphany read, a secret personal sin directs them, holding them now as in reaction to constant malevolence, and that old sin sharpening their eyes to cruelty. No explanation is given in a portrait where quite simply, quote, the malice of evil glittered in their hard eyes, and a rictus of cruel malignity lit up greyly their old bony faces. The most intriguing addition in a portrait is that the goatish creatures are given language, quote, soft language issued from their spittleless lips, and again, soft language issuing from their lips. These hybrid forms don't actually speak, rather soft language issues from their lips. Whether this soft language is inaudible or unintelligible, the many sibilant sounds suggest a hissing serpent. In a wide-ranging argument, Sangam Macduff in Panepiphanal World, James Joyce's Epiphanies, shows how Joyce adapted Epiphany number 6 to reflect on silence and repetition. Macduff discusses instances in a portrait where speech is, quote, reduced to pure materiality, the repetition of meaningless sound, unquote. And indeed, besieged in every possible sense as he faces his personal demons, Stephen couldn't possibly apprehend their mutterings other than as senseless, empty repetition. Bosch likewise moves marvelously between the physical, mental, and spiritual spheres. Indeed, his work may seem strange to modern viewers as he confronts them with a world of dreams or rather nightmares. His landscapes are devil-infested, ghosts rise like hallucinations, and there are endless, wondrous, grotesque and whimsical creatures, monstrous chimeras and profane, farcical, demonic motifs. Many forms seem to metamorphose into hybrids before our eyes. Disembodied heads walk on large feet, and some bizarre creatures combine human and animal forms and sometimes even inanimate objects. Bosch shared this taste for monsters with his age, which was fascinated by the grotesque and the unnatural. Even so, critics agree that Bosch's iconography, as well as his style and technique, remain unique. While densely allegorical, Bosch's work is also strangely realistic, especially regarding the psychological portrayal of his actors, and it inspires ever new interpretations, depending on how scholars gauge the painter's knowledge of literary sources, popular literature, alchemical symbols, and contemporary proverbs and idioms. Many of these interpretations remain controversial and elusive, and it is fair to claim that in terms of exegesis, Bosch's work is as fertile a hunting ground as are Joyce's writings. Of course, it is impossible for us today to experience Bosch's depictions of hell as did his contemporaries. To both artists, the human senses are of paramount importance, and they evoke them vividly in word and paint. In addition to their unsurpassed technical skills, Joyce and Bosch in their respective arts depart from convention through the apparently infinite power of their imagination. Though their minds were shaped by fixed medieval Christian concepts of the world, they playfully combine and juxtapose dualist and monist and circular and open concepts, questioning neat distinctions and unequivocal interpretations. Furthermore, their works reveal an impish sense of humor even in religious matters, prefigured in the writer's case perhaps by how the young Joyce liked to crawl about his siblings playing the serpent to their Adam and Eve, and to reenact hellfire burnings of malefactors, that is, if we are to believe Ellman. Employing detailed images of amorphous imaginary beings, Bosch and Joyce spin strange and wondrous fantasies. Bosch was born around 1450 and died in 1516, yet, as their works attest, the Christianity that shaped Bosch during the late Middle Ages still shaped Joyce. The authority of the Catholic Church in Ireland at the turn of the 20th century, and arguably until the mid-1960s, was strong and largely unquestioned. Religion permeated all aspects of everyday life. Most people still believed in the reality of Satan and hell, and preparation for death and judgment was one of the chief concerns of the Church. Unsurprisingly, the four last things that are the focus of Father Arnold's retreat sermons also feature prominently in Bosch's work, as will be seen. Bosch lived and worked in 's-Hertogenbosch, then a thriving commercial city in the Duchy of Brabant, with extensive trade connections with Northern Europe and Italy. As it had neither a ducal court, nor a university, nor a bishopric, 's-Hertogenbosch had a predominantly middle-class commercial population. In and around the city, there were numerous convents and monasteries. Like his father and brothers, Bosch belonged to the Brotherhood of Our Lady, which was founded in 1318 and still exists. The Brotherhood, a guild of clergy and laity devoted to the Virgin Mary, was a large and wealthy organization, and with members drawn from across the northern Netherlands, the Rhineland and Westphalia. It played a dominant role in the city's religious and cultural life. Bosch also enjoyed the patronage of highly placed members of the church and nobility, among them Hendrik III of Nassau. Philip II of Spain acquired several of his works in the late 16th century. While both Bosch and Joyce were members of a confraternity, the importance of the painter's relationship with the Brotherhood of Our Lady was obviously of an entirely different order from the writer's rather short-lived prefecture of the sodality of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Although Bosch was critical of the church, he likely was profoundly religious and certainly didn't reject it the way Joyce did. Not only did Bosch never turn away from the church, he also enjoyed the patronage of some of its highly placed members, from which we can deduce that they saw nothing objectionable in his works. Joyce, as we know, was not as fortunate. For Bosch, sin and folly were the fundamental conditions of human existence, and hellfire the destiny facing most of humankind. It is important to remember that fear of the devil flourished throughout the entire Middle Ages and reached an extreme height in Bosch's lifetime. Most of his contemporaries firmly believed in the reality of Satan and hell, that devils actively and maliciously intervened in human affairs, both directly and through agents such as witches and sorcerers, and that the Antichrist would appear before the second coming of Christ and the last judgment. People would have been familiar with the unending torments of the damned from lurid, detailed descriptions in countless sermons and books. Also, numerous spiritual meditations focused on the last judgment and hell. Bosch would not have viewed the world as a stage upon which a struggle between the equally powerful forces of good and evil was enacted. This would have denied the omnipotence of God. Rather, he and his contemporaries believed that God permitted Satan to send tribulations to men for the good of their souls. As Saint Augustine, who reinforced the concept of eternal punishment for Western Christianity, had explained, God allows the devil to attack even the saints so that, quote, by outward temptation they may grow in grace, unquote. In voluntary submission to these troubles, the men and women of God achieved the most perfect imitation of Christ. In The 7 Deadly Sins and the 4 Last Things, Bosch explores humankind's existential guilt and chances of salvation. The painting groups the 7 deadly sins around the eye of God, in whose pupil stands the resurrected Christ displaying his wounds. Written around God's pupil is Cave, cave, Deus videt, beware, beware, God is watching. One banderole is unfurling above the central image and one below it. On the lower one is written, quote, I will hide my face from them, I will see what their end will be, unquotes from Deuteronomy. And indeed, what their end will be is depicted in the 4 smaller circles from top left: death, judgment, heaven, and hell, the 4 last things as understood by Bosch and his contemporaries. It is an understanding remarkably similar to that of Irish Catholicism in Joyce's time and even beyond. The 7 deadly sins and the 4 last things of Bosch is likely to have been used as an allegorical, moralizing object of meditation, particularly as an aid to examining one's conscience before going to confession. Likewise, an examination of conscience was central to the retreat at Belvedere. There, Father Arnall opens proceedings with the following words: remember only thy last things and thou shalt not sin forever. A quotation he carelessly attributes to Ecclesiastes rather than Ecclesiasticus. Even glancing at the composition of heaven in the 7 deadly sins, one is impressed with its large, imposing edifice resplendent with gold. The scene is orderly, measured, and predominantly static. This reign of harmony and the complete absence of conflict, both here and indeed generally in depictions or accounts of heaven, may be one of the reasons why chapter 3 of a portrait omits the sermon on heaven entirely, even though Father Arnall had announced it at the start of the retreat. Bosch's tondo depicting hell, in contrast, is very dynamic and shows several action scenes in the fore, middle, and background. It is alive with human beings, composite creatures, fanciful demons and animals, among them frogs and toads, reptiles and birds, some of them associated with evil, particularly the toad. This tondo is reddish in color. In the foreground right, there is a big fire burning under a cauldron out of which several human heads peep. In the background, the entire horizon is ablaze with the fires of hell. In his depiction of the sinful life, Bosch often chose particular social classes and groups, such as corrupt judges, the miserly rich, loose-living clergy, monks, and nuns, with lust and gluttony seen as the preeminent monastic vices, as well as quacks and charlatans. Again and again, he effectively expressed the medieval conception of hell as a state where the divinely ordained laws of nature have disintegrated into repugnant chaos. The imaginative experience of people at the time must have been vivid and synesthetic, especially as they believed that the agony of the damned persisted at its highest intensity, not only for all eternity, but that even the most horribly mutilated souls were perpetually recreated to endure their sufferings with renewed strength. Widespread fear of the end of the world in the year 1500 would have contributed to Bosch's apocalyptic vision of God's judgment. Though the terrifying scenes of violence and suffering must result from his own understanding of the apocalypse. In his depiction of the end of the world, he remains peerless. Alas, I have no time to go into it, but among the most lurid descriptions of the torments of hell known to Bosch was almost certainly the vision of an Irish monk, recorded in Regensburg in 1149, namely the vision of Tondal. It is considered the most fully realized and therefore the most terrifying vision of hell produced in medieval Europe prior to Dante's Inferno in the 14th century, and was translated into numerous languages. A Dutch translation was published in Bosch's hometown of 's-Hertogenbosch in 1484. Finally, as I mentioned at the outset, I would like to connect these reflections on the art of Bosch and Joyce with some vital present-day concerns. Today, far fewer people believe in hell the way Joyce and Bosch had imagined it, and many believers reject the idea of an eternally unforgiving God. Yet, as an analogy, the notion of hell is still frequently used, be it with reference to our private lives, to politics, or the environment. But this all is applied to the here and now. One thinks of such massive landfills as the Teufelsberg in Berlin or the Fresh Kills landfill in Staten Island, New York, or the chillingly named Great Pacific Garbage Patch, the largest accumulation of ocean plastic in the world between Hawaii and California. Natural disasters were once considered manifestations of the wrath of God. Today, drought, bushfires, floods, and rising sea levels exemplify some of our modern-day hells, and ironically, they're also the consequences of overconsumption and pursuits advertised as heavenly pleasures. Earth's regenerative capacity is under huge pressure, and loss of biodiversity will have catastrophic consequences, especially for global food security. It is human systems and activities that have led to the gravity of the human predicament. As if according to the Wakian motto, the same anew, it appears that our destructive proclivities continue largely unchecked, making humanity pose an ever greater danger to itself and the environment on which our life depends. I have mentioned the Anthropocene earlier, a term frequently used in connection with post-human concerns. There is not enough time to say much about the post-human humanities, an emerging academic inquiry, so I'll be brief. Post-humanism is a scholarly vision and one scholarly endeavor to end disciplinary insularity resulting from the current tendency towards extreme specialization. Rather than simply reproducing established forms and methods of disciplinary knowledge, post-human theory confronts how changes in society, culture, and technology require scholars to rethink radically what they do, theoretically, methodologically, and ethically. The human is enmeshed in a larger problem, and traditional humanism is no longer adequate to understanding the entangled, complex relations that humans have with animals, the environment, and technology. Consequently, and crucially here, post-human theory seeks to offer a new theory of knowledge that is not anthropocentric and therefore not centered in Cartesian dualism. Instead, it seeks to integrate the greater number of focuses of various disciplines and make novel connections through transdisciplinary cooperation. The task is immense and complex. It is to be hoped that inspiration may also be found in literature and the arts, where Joyce's everyman Leopold Bloom, a finished example of the new womanly man, a possible illustration. Rather than representing an anthropocentric hero, Bloom epitomizes a character that is permeable to his environment and permeated by it, hence combining a plurality of perspectives. He's observant, modest, and kind, feels connected to the world, if not the universe, and displays empathy throughout the day and into the night. He adopts his cat's perspective and is in sympathy with the nags he passes, feels pity for Mrs. Purefoy in her protracted labor, wonders about the influence of climate on temperament, and reflects on the properties of water. In contrast with the straightforward account of geological time and early life forms in the Hebrew scriptures, Ithaca has Bloom contemplate various constellations and mediate on vast periods of time, minute microorganisms and gigantic numbers. Eventually, in the universal perspective of the penultimate episode of Ulysses, Bloom and Stephen, quote, become heavenly bodies, wanderers like the stars at which they gaze, unquote, as Joyce wrote to Frank Bodgen. A small part of the solution to the enormous human predicament may well lie in greater reflectiveness and relationality, in a fundamental rethinking of social, philosophical, and economic relationships between scholars, policymakers, politicians, the general public, and the natural world. It is to our detriment that we have not yet taken meaningful action to mitigate against the anthropocentric behavior that may well be our downfall. The compulsively ordering mind, though vital to human survival, needs to be supplemented by constant critical examination and reach beyond blinkered differentiation towards a more collaborative approach to understanding underlying relationships and overarching principles. Of course, inquiry will always give rise to new questions, and that is precisely what Bosch and Joyce suggest with exquisite brushstrokes and potent words. Though one wrote relatively little and of the other as few as 20 paintings and less than 10 drawings survive, both propose again and again how to break free of the constraints of binary thinking. With seemingly inexhaustible imagination and an irrepressible sense of humor, Joyce and Bosch point to novel and more complex correspondences. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christine. I'm just full of the most amazing images right now. It was so wonderful to see so many of Bosch's works and just dive into them, and you really were the most wonderful guide into this world, and so much. I think I assumed that Finnegan's Wake would be what we'd be really thinking of, but it was incredible to see so much of these images and references, particularly in portrait, and of course Ulysses there, that these visions, I think I had forgotten about those hellish visions that Joyce was giving us in his earlier works as well. Please, I think I forgot to mention that we're delighted that Christine can take some questions now and in a short Q&A. So if you wouldn't mind, I'll go straight into the questions. I don't know if you've had time to see them. The first was one question that I had, which was, is there evidence that Joyce saw Bosch's work in person and commented on it? Andrea is talking about that the reproductions perhaps would have been in black and white, maybe, that he would have seen. But do we have evidence of him traveling to museums or seeing them in books or anything?
I am not aware that Joyce ever saw Bosch's paintings, and I also have to say that unfortunately the slides don't do justice to Bosch's work at all. The colors, if one ever has an opportunity to see the real thing, they are like nothing else. So I do apologize, I did my best, but also book reproductions, they're just really no comparison to the real thing.
I know I was lucky enough to visit a wonderful exhibition in Madrid a number of years ago. And yeah, we sneaked in because we didn't have the right time slot, but they let us go in and see it, and they really are, you're right, they're incredible. Another question here, Dante's Inferno seems to have a huge influence on both of these artists. So Bosch and Joyce. And Joe is wondering what influence drugs, including alcohol, may have played in these works of arts, or maybe hallucinations of other kinds.
Alcohol. I have to say, I know nothing about Bosch's possible consumption of alcohol. I haven't come across anything that would tell us anything about this, because really one of the main problems with Bosch is that so little is known about him. We don't even know his birthday. There are no letters, no diaries. There are very few references, municipal records. We know he got, and a few commissions that he got that are entered in the book of the sodality. So I have no idea whether he was high on anything, but the lurid sermons, that also it's often pointed out now that really the more one knows about contemporary sayings, so vernacular sayings, proverbs, superstitions, alchemy, very important for some of the very strange shapes and funnels and cauldrons and what have you. They were hugely important at the time. And it's really, there is a lot of speculation and often even totally contradictory interpretations by specialists, most famously maybe regarding the Garden of Earthly Delights. Some people think this is a real celebration of an innocent kind of unfallen humanity, and other people think, if you look more closely at it, everywhere you see corruption, even in the side panel that depicts paradise. There are very strange creatures there. He does this, he sort of subverts what he does all the time. A bit like Joyce, say, with, you know, Joyce's catalogues, where you think you know where this is going, and then he adds a few items that really just don't fit the bill. So you always watch or read at your own peril, kind of.
We have an interesting one here. We have the announcement, safe arrival of the Antichrist in Ulysses, but is Molly a kind of anti-Bosch because she is entirely natural and has no concept of sin or unthinkable thoughts?
Wow. It's a big claim. I have to say, I couldn't argue this very convincingly right now, but I'm not sure that I would be convinced that Molly would have no concept of sin. I don't know that we have enough in the book to reach that conclusion, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I think I agree with you. I think she has a concept of it, but she maybe pushes it aside. But she definitely is aware of sin, I think. There's another question here. I was struck by how well Bosch and Joyce go side by side. To a reader of Joyce, would you say that Bosch can help appreciate or reflect on Joyce's texts?
I definitely think so. I definitely think so, especially the way he just explodes whatever he's doing. So of course there are paintings, say, of saints or more traditional religious paintings that are not so much what I showed this evening. But by and large, he sets out to do something and he always kind of subverts it. Or it's not even subverted, it's just, it's never binary, it's always tainted, it's always multiple, it doesn't hold still. I think to me, they have an awful lot in common. They use things and then they use forms or symbols and then transform them into something that has a kind of a sting in the tail or starts exploding what has just been created. Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And the importance, even I like to think, even though, I mean, obviously I don't understand it, but if Bosch depicted quite a lot of proverbs, and I think that, music, he was very interested in music. There's a lot of music in all his paintings. Often we have to be very suspicious if we see instruments being played, because so often it leads people, that the idea is that leads people astray. The worst thing is the bagpipes, I have read. This is only lewd. Anytime you see somebody play bagpipes, and you see many of them, you see couples dancing, and you know this is not going to lead to a happy ending. So
I was at a very interesting talk last week by a friend from New York, the Finnegan's Wake Society of New York, Peter Reichenberg, who talked about his theory on Finnegan's Wake, that it's essentially the date of Finnegan's Wake is the 7th of April, 1928, which is Holy Saturday, Easter Saturday. And I was so fascinated by this. Of course, to me, it made sense of Finnegan's Wake, which I find so complicated and so interesting. But that on this date, which is, of course, between the fall of man and the rise, the fall of Christ and his resurrection. But on this day, in my learning of concepts of hell, I had never been taught that it's the day, Easter Saturday, that Christ descends, is harrowing in hell, and he descends into hell. So potentially from this talk was that the whole of Finnegan's Wake is actually some hellish vision, a bit like what we've just seen, and that all the characters in all the world can appear on this day, that that this journey into hell perhaps is the, of all of that we're seeing in Finnegan's Wake.
I think you're absolutely right in saying that, because I know that Pinamonti, the text that Father Arnold quotes so liberally, and it's not just Pinamonti, but this idea that in hell it is dark, but at the same time you can see all these afflictions of all the other damned who are being tortured. Just, all these paradoxes of the fire that burns, but it doesn't destroy, because you have to be recreated so you can be burnt again. So I think in Finnegan's Wake there is a lot of this cyclical, and darkness descends, and yet somehow you do perceive things. No, definitely.
We have another question here. Do you see a link between how Joyce has populated Nighttown in Ulysses and Bosch's vision?
Yeah, I think that is certainly a possible way of looking at it, because all this nightmarish, mad kind of stuff that is happening was certainly in Circe, where a lot is psychological, seems psychologically motivated, and repressed things and unconscious things are acted out and given a voice. I think there is a lot of that in Bosch. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it was wonderful to see these creatures and shapes and these changing of human forms, and these visions of human legs and these monstrous arms or heads, or it's just the freedom of the Nighttime episode, that this change, this constant change, and anything can be anything at any time. It's interesting. It's almost like a Boschian vision to me, when the lawnmowers can appear with, speaking and, driving towards us at any time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This is wonderful, but I'm conscious that we're getting over our time, and I don't want to delay you too much. I promised I'd keep our Q&A quite short, Christine. So,
Irina, may I say one more thing only? Because it's really important to me. I do think it's astonishing when you look at the centuries and centuries of serious and seriously imaginative preoccupation with hell and what it might look like and feel like and smell like and so on. And nowadays, for so many people, this is not really something that's very relevant anymore. At the same time, when we look at what we are doing to the environment, I'm really very serious about this. And when we look at warfare nowadays, and when you think of the past century, the kind of warfare that has become possible, whether it's the Nazis or whether it's in the East, or you can almost take any decade really, and how we now don't have to be somewhere anymore to kill so many people, to poison them, to do whatever. If we think of solitary confinement, where people are kept in solitary confinement, undergoing terrible torture in Abu Ghraib or in Guantanamo Bay, it doesn't matter. But it's just, I think it's really very interesting how what during the Middle Ages and beyond was such an all-consuming, not all-consuming, but very, very present and very much consuming preoccupation. How nowadays we do have fairly kind of apt applications for these concepts still. And I do think that this binary thinking, that there is something very, very, very flawed about it. And I do think that Joyce and Bosch both show us how it is always, I was going to say, a hell of a lot more complex than binary.
yes, absolutely. Do you think that we in our society are filtering out these hellish visions, that we try and remove ourselves from these images that we see, that we can't maybe
Yeah, I think in
cope
fact,
with them?
I think in fact we couldn't cope with them at all. Do you know? I mean, it was very cruel in Bosch's time. It was very rough what was happening and what people saw, the kind of torture, punishment, mutilation of people, and the smells and sounds, they were very real. So for us, it's become something else, but we are very good at kind of distancing things. And I just think the whole concepts, they are absolutely valid, still only differently, maybe.
Oh, well, it was such a pleasure. Thank you so much. And after a whole year, we finally managed it, and I'm very grateful. I really enjoyed it, and I'm
Very much.
especially, yeah, I'm going to look for all my worms in in Joyce. Really, really interesting, and thank you so much. And I'm sure I speak on behalf of our wonderful audience here tonight. Thank you everybody for attending, and yeah, I'll invite you all to our next events and lectures, and hopefully it won't be before too long. Thank you so much, Christine.
And thank you very much. Thank you.